Alright, hello everyone. This video will be going up on March 27th, Friday. It'll include a review of the lessons from Thursday and also a little introduction to the assignment I'm going to give you on Active Classroom. You should have already seen videos and read the section of the book that talks about the causes of World War I. So that's what I'm going to get into today. If you were to look at these standards, what they want you to know is the origins of the war, the impact that it has, the impact the United States has when we get involved. You're supposed to know why we at first are neutral and then move toward getting involved. It has a lot to do with German submarines, which is a new weapon being used during this war, their attacks on American ships, which are supposed to be neutral, and something specifically called the Zimmerman telegram. We'll see things about both of those topics today. So I'm going to review the topics from yesterday's lesson and also introduce you to the active classroom activities that are part of what you're going to do for Friday. Okay, I did ask you to do 3 parts in this lesson, and if you haven't already done it, this video can help you get these things completed. The first was to watch a video called The Roots of War and to get some information on the long-term causes of World War I. I'm going to go through that with you and help you complete that. If you didn't already get it done, you can get it done after you watch this and still submit it and get credit for it. Okay, so what you had to fill in the front or in the first column was the term or the long-term cause that's being described. There's a definition there, and it actually goes in order with the video, so hopefully this wasn't too confusing if you watched that. I gave you the definition. In the third column, you have to tell me, how does this lead to conflict in Europe? Why is this making countries fight or want to fight each other? And the last one, I just asked you to find a picture or a symbol that you could copy and paste in there to match with this cause of the war. There's a good little mnemonic device you can use to remember the long-term causes of World War I. And the word main will help you remember it. If you remember M-A-I-N, main, like the 4 main causes of the war: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. We'll talk about all 4. So that's the first one. You had this definition. Nationalism is when you have extreme pride in your country or in your nationality, which there's nothing wrong with being patriotic and having pride in your country. But if you're so prideful that it makes you hateful toward other countries, then it does become problematic. And every country wants to prove that it's the best. It's kind of like the super sports fan here. He doesn't just love his own team, he hates that big rival. If you watch the video, there are a few things you can say for how this might lead to conflict in Europe. Well, nations are competitive with each other, there's hatred among nations, and every country is kind of out for itself. It's putting its own interest above world cooperation. Another thing they mentioned was that many nations or groups of people didn't have their own countries at that time. There were people that were under the control of other nations that were denied the chance to use their own languages or weren't really given a country of their own. So it would encourage many people to fight for independence, to want to get rid of their colonial rulers. The second term, imperialism, is something you've seen and we've talked about in terms of the United States becoming imperialistic at the beginning of the 1900s. So imperialism means you're extending your authority economically, politically, or militarily. Well, European nations, just like they're doing in this cartoon here, had been competing over territories and taking over different parts of the world for over a century, competing for colonies in Asia and in Africa. How could this lead to war? Well, if both countries want the same piece of land, they're going to come into conflict over it. In the video, you might have seen that France and Germany almost went to war over controlling Morocco. So it's going to create rivalries abroad as well as at home. Nations are fighting for trading rights, for resources, as well as land. The third term here is militarism. You see the word military right in there. It means you're going to build up your armed forces in aggressive preparedness for war. So every country wants to have the biggest army, the biggest navy, the most ships, the most tanks, all these weapons of war. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with having a well-stocked military to defend your country. but I always use this expression to help people understand how this could be potentially dangerous. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In other words, if you only have one tool, you're going to try and use that to fix all of your problems. And I think that's what happens when countries are focused on building up their military strength. If there is an argument, they're going to be likely to go to a military solution. They're going to be more likely to fight or go to war than they would be to talk things out. If you think about if you ever had a friend who was training as a boxer every day, just working on hitting bags, working on throwing hands. If he's walking home one afternoon and someone shoves him in the back, he's not going to turn around and have a conversation. He's going to be ready to throw a punch. Just like with countries building up their militaries, if there is an argument, they're not going to be likely to talk things out. They're going to go to war. So in the video it mentioned that all these different countries, Germany, France, England, they're all building up. It's a big arms race. Who can have the biggest stockpile of weapons? Who can have the most soldiers? Who can have the most battleships? A naval and military arms race. Okay, the last term is alliances. It means countries are going to agree to protect each other, join together, band together. In some ways, it's a very positive thing, right? Smaller countries are protected from bigger countries. There's strength in numbers. And they thought this was a good idea. They thought this was a way to avoid war. If we band together, it'll be less likely that a war breaks out. But there is a problem. Every nation is promising, if you're attacked, I got your back. The problem is, if two countries were going to fight each other, it might be a small one-on-one conflict. But if both countries have these alliances, it can escalate very quickly into a worldwide war. Just like a fight between two people. If it's one person versus one person, okay, it's not a great thing, but it might end right there. But if both people have a crew, have a gang behind them, and they get into a fight, everybody else is going to jump in. It's going to be a much bigger mess. That's what happens in World War I. So a situation where a small conflict could have been just worked out between two countries or fought out between two countries can escalate to a worldwide war, and it's exactly what happens. Alright, the second activity I asked you to work on goes with chapter 19, section 1 of the book, which talks about World War I beginning. The first part I just asked you to list the countries that were members of these two alliances, the Allies and the Central Powers, and then there are some other questions beneath that, so I'll go through all these too. The three countries that were members, the big three that were members of the Allies, which was also called the Triple Entente, were France, Great Britain, and Russia. So everything you see in green on this little map. That is the side when the U.S. joins, the U.S. will join with. Now remember, the war breaks out in 1914. The U.S. will not join until 1917. Americans had many reasons for being against this war, for trying to stay out of it, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. As far as the Central Powers go, they were known as the Triple Alliance. The big three were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. You may have seen that the Italians were members of the Central Powers, but they're not at the end. They switched sides during the war. It's kind of a sneaky move. They recognized the Central Powers were not going to be the winners, so they made a little slip there and switched over to be on the Allies, and they were on the winning side for the end. So what you saw in the video talked about how things got set off, because these alliances for a while preserved peace. But if you look at the map of the world, everything kicks off in this area called Serbia, or in another area called Bosnia, which was under the control of Austria-Hungary. Now what happens is, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, a guy called Franz Ferdinand, is in Bosnia, visiting that territory. He's the next person to be in line to take over Austria-Hungary. And while he's there, he and his wife are assassinated. And the guy that killed him was somebody from Serbia, a man named Gavrilo Princip. Now Serbians wanted all Serbian people to be united in one nation. So if Serbia is talking here, it says we just want to be an independent nation for all Serbians. But Austria-Hungary says, Serbians, you shot our Archduke, want revenge. So even though it's the actions of a terrorist, Austria-Hungary is going to want revenge by declaring war on Serbia. Here's how things escalate. Germany has an alliance with Austria-Hungary, so they say, hey, if you start a war, we got your back. But Russia has an alliance with Serbia and says, hey, we'll back you up. France and Great Britain are teamed up with Russia. They say, Russia, we got your back. So instead of just a small fight or a small war between two countries, it's escalated and all of Europe is involved. That kind of helps you with the next question, which is, had the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand lead to the beginning of World War I? Well, after that assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and to keep it simple, the alliance system pulled one nation after another into the conflict. You don't have to go through all the details. Here's the timeline of it. Germany would declare war on Russia. Germany declared war on France and on Belgium. Britain, in response, declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Great War had begun. I asked about trench warfare in no man's land. World War I is famous for its brutality and for its trench warfare. This is the way fighting was done. Weapons had improved. The machine gun was available. Flamethrowers were available. Tanks, even planes were being used for the first time in World War I. So soldiers learned, we have to dig down fortifications. If we don't do this, it's going to be slaughter. So trench warfare is the military forces are attacking and counterattacking through the system of fortified trenches or ditches, rather than being out on an open battlefield. What it means is it's very hard for either side to gain any ground. One side will launch an attack out of their trench just to be shot down by machine gun fire. The other side will counterattack, but neither side is really able to gain any ground because it's almost impossible to overtake your enemy's trench. The space between the trenches was known as no man's land, because if you got caught out there, there's a good chance you wouldn't survive. It looked like the surface of the moon, totally destroyed, big craters where bombs had exploded, barbed wire strewn about everywhere to stop guys from running through it. If you were to look at an example of a battlefield, this is what it would look like from overhead. So the British trench might be here, the German trench might be here, and sometimes they were close enough to hear each other. And there are a couple of stories. There's a very famous one called the Christmas Truce. I encourage you to look it up. Of Christmas, the first year of the war, 1914. Both sides kind of called time out, walked into the middle of the trench, walked out into the middle of no man's land, shook hands with each other, shared food, showed pictures, played soccer. They pretty much just called time out and stopped all the madness and the fighting, which is in some ways a beautiful and very tragic moment, because these soldiers in the middle of this war still recognize the humanity of each other, but ultimately the people in charge said, we can't have this anymore. There's a war to win. So they threatened their soldiers. They said, if you try to carry on like this, we'll have you executed. So they either got rid of those soldiers or forced them to go back to fighting. But in the midst of this horror, this hell of war, there was that tragic human moment, the Christmas truce. Anyway, this is what the battlefields look like. War starts in 1914. For 3 years, Americans are trying to stay out of it. And this cartoon reflects how many people felt. Uncle Sam's over here, and the woman represents democracy. And the caption says it's the only way we can save her. And this is supposed to be war-mad Europe. And it says, stay out for my sake as well as your own. In America, it says it's the last refuge, the last safe place of democracy. So many Americans felt like this was a war going on across the ocean. It was none of our business and we should stay out of it. And many different groups had reasons to be against the war. The first group in that chart there was socialists. Socialists are people that believe things should be distributed evenly by the government. They're against the idea of capitalism. They think it creates a few people who are very rich and most people who have nothing. They are saying this war is a capitalist imperialist struggle between countries like Germany and England. They want control of markets and territories. It's got nothing to do with the United States. Let's stay out of it. Then there are pacifists. Pacifists are people who are nonviolent, who believe war is evil, and they said the United States should set an example of peace for the world, so they didn't want us to get involved. Of course, parents, why would parents be against this? Well, parents are saying, if we get involved in this war, my son might be drafted, and I don't want to send my son off to fight to be exposed to the horrors of war, or maybe even to die. Several other groups, like naturalized citizens, why are they against the war? Well, naturalized citizens are people that were born in a different country and became citizens of the United States. Many of those people are going to have ties or connections to the countries where they came from. Now think about it, if you were German, you wouldn't want the United States to go to war with Germany. Irish people, because they had suffered from treatment by the British, really were hateful toward the British and didn't want the US to get involved and help the British win. There are other people in America that have close ties to Britain, right? We speak the same language as the British, our government is similar, our laws are similar, so there are plenty of people who had connections or had sympathies with other countries, but all these were good reasons for them to say the US should stay out, should not get involved. What's going to happen that pushes the US toward war? Well, the British are going to do some things that push us toward war. One is that they're going to blockade the seas and not let any of our ships, even neutral ships, come to or from Germany. That threatens freedom of the seas, and the United States doesn't want that. Even though we're declaring ourselves neutral, we are selling tons of weapons, tons of war material to the British, to the French, much more to that side, to the Allies, than we ever do to the Germans. So that's what the cartoon is pointing out, that Uncle Sam is being a little bit two-faced here. We're promising to be peaceful and keep out of the war, but also selling war materials to help one side win. In many ways, that's not really neutral. If we're giving loans and giving supplies or selling supplies to one side more than the other, we're not really staying out of it. Another thing the book didn't mention is that the communications between Europe and America were really controlled by the British, because information, the cable that would have carried news from Germany to the US, was cut by the British, and the British really emphasized or played up how brutal the Germans were to turn the American public against Germany. Now, the Germans did do some things that would turn Americans against them. One is that they're using unrestricted submarine warfare. So they have these submarines, these Untersee boats, that again are completely disguised. Out on the seas, you wouldn't be able to spot them coming, right? They're underwater. And they're going to attack any ship they think is carrying supplies to or from one of their enemies. The US is saying we're supposed to be neutral, you shouldn't be attacking our ships, and at times they are doing that. There's a famous incident, a ship called the Lusitania is sunk by a German submarine. The Lusitania was a British ship, but there were 128 Americans aboard who were killed when the Germans attacked that ship, so Americans wanted revenge for that. That happened in 1915, so it didn't make us immediately enter the war, but it was one thing that turned us against them. The Germans for a while promised to stop using submarine attacks, and then eventually resumed doing it. They figured they could win the war before the US would ever get involved or would ever do something about it, and they were wrong about that. The other factor that really pushes the US towards war with Germany is something called the Zimmermann Note. The British intercepted and shared with the United States this message, this telegram that was coming from Germany to Mexico. And Germany was saying, Mexico, if you help us in this war, we will help you get back all that land the US took from you. Remember all that territory after the Mexican-American War? Pretty much Arizona, Nevada, Texas, a huge amount of land in the Southwest. Germany saying, if you help Germany win this war, Mexico, we'll help you get that land back. When Americans hear this, of course we're not so happy about that, right? We're furious. And that's what the cartoon is pointing out, this German plan. He's talking to Mexico here, saying, join with Germany and you get a bit of the United States. We weren't going to have any of that. The last thing that's going to push the US toward war against Germany and Austria-Hungary is that Russia has a revolution and they overthrow their czar. That's the Russian word for emperor. They make their country a more representative government at that time, more democratic. So now France, England, Russia, these are all democratic nations, and all the people on the Central Power side, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, these are all brutal monarchies, and and the US wants to join up with the democracies. Okay, the last part of this activity was to watch the video about the war in Europe. It talks about how brutal the fighting was, the new tools of technology, why Americans are angered by submarine attacks, and what causes more deaths, the British blockade or the German submarine warfare. I'm going to go through, I didn't write out these answers for you, but I'll talk through them with you, and then I'll get to what you're going to work on today. So first question asks, why do the battle lines remain almost stationary? Well, it's because of trench warfare. There were trenches that stretched thousands of miles across the Western Front in France, and it was nearly impossible for either side to gain the ground. If you were to look, sometimes they were more elaborate than this, but this is what trenches look like. Now, periodically, these guys would be ordered to go over the top and attack an enemy trench, but the chances of survival would not be so great. There's something a little gruesome here. This is called trench foot. Because the soldiers would be in these trenches for weeks or months, standing in cold, muddy, filthy water, often their feet would get infected like this. That's a real picture of a man's feet. There's nothing that can be done to save them at that point. They just have to be amputated. So trench warfare, pretty gruesome, pretty brutal part of World War I. 2 asks, what new tools of technology are being used for the war? Well, all kinds of deadly new weapons. You can see in the picture that machine guns are being used. I mentioned before planes and tanks being used. Massive artillery, huge guns that could shoot a shell miles and miles. You might notice that in the picture this man has a mask on here. That's a gas mask. Poison gas was being used for the first time during World War I with devastating effects. Chemical weapons like that have since been banned, even in warfare. But during World War I they're being used. I think I might have mentioned flamethrowers before, and also submarines. These are all new tools of technology, which again are making the fighting more devastating than ever, and the death toll just unimaginable. Why are Americans angered by German submarine attacks? Well, really, the Germans are kind of patrolling the Atlantic coast, and they're going to attack any ships they think are giving help to the Allies. But the U.S. is saying, hey, we want freedom of the seas here. We're not involved in this war. You shouldn't be attacking our ships. Now, the last question asks, which resulted in more deaths? The British blockade of Germany or German submarine warfare? Well, German submarine attacks killed about 75,000 people. But when the British blockaded the German coast and wouldn't let anything in or out, that led to about 750,000 deaths. Because the blockade stopped anything that was labeled contraband, and that included fertilizer and things that would be used to grow food. So the German people starved as a result of the blockade. So what the British were doing to Germany was far worse, far more devastating than the German submarine attacks. Okay, the activity I sent to you today is going to be an active classroom. And if you go through this PowerPoint, you can click on this link, but it'll also have the link in the Verge page for you to click on. And you're just going to see it'll talk about some things that are happening in the United States during the war. And that's got to be the main focus. Of course, you could talk forever about all these different battles and all the consequences of the war, but we really have to focus on why did America get involved, what difference do we make, and then how does it affect life in the United States, because this is U.S. history. So you'll see those, there are some pictures, it'll have background information, some pictures to examine, questions based on that information. Okay, not too difficult, should be pretty clear for you, and then you can just submit that one through Active Classroom. Looking ahead to next week, on Monday, I'll probably give you some information and notes about the domestic impact, just to kind of reiterate what you learned about today, and also when the war ends, something called the Treaty of Versailles. I'm going to have you guys watch the BrainPop video about World War I too. I think it's a good one, it's a good summary. Some point next week, probably Tuesday or Wednesday, I will have you do the quiz. I'll put it on Verge again about imperialism in World War I. This one should be easy. Anything I'm giving you guys now, I understand, is practically open notes, so I'm expecting everyone to do well with it. After that, we'll get into the 1920s in America. They call it the Roaring Twenties, and when that comes to an end, the worst period in American history, called the Great Depression. Probably some connections between what's going on now and what's going to happen now as a result of all these closings and this coronavirus and what the country suffered through back during the Great Depression. Hopefully it doesn't get that bad. If you're watching this all the way through, you probably have already heard they've extended the school closures to April 24th, so we won't be back until then. I hope that you're doing your best to stay on top of this stuff and not miss out on everything we're supposed to be learning here. And I do hope we return, but we'll just have to stay posted and find out what's going to happen. All right? I hope everybody's staying safe, doing well. I'll talk to you soon.